Everyone is talking about Jeffrey Dahmer, but somebody who is just as bad is Dean Corll. And you've probably never heard of him because he was never caught. But his official nickname was the Candyman. And unlike Jeffrey, Dean enjoyed torturing every single victim. Between 1970 to 1973, Dean tortured, abused, and ended the lives of at least 28 boys in the Houston, Texas area. And to locals, Dean seemed like a nice guy. He worked at his family's small candy shop. He would often give free candy to the local kids, giving him the name the Candyman. Behind this facade, Dean was killing young boys left and right, and no one knew it. It wasn't actually until 1973, when he was murdered himself by his accomplice, that all of this came to light. This all started in 1967 when Dean met 12-year-old David Brooks at the time. David came from a broken home and considered Dean to be like a father. 2 years into the friendship with David, Dean began to groom him, and it was at this point that he started having him perform favors for him, let's put it that way, for money. It's then in 1970 that David catches Dean in the act of assaulting 2 teenage boys. At this point, Dean bribes David into silence, saying, "I will give you a car, I will give you money, just keep your mouth shut." Dean then proposes to David that every time he brings back and lures a boy back to his house, he will pay him $200. David Brooks then agrees. At this point, they start to identify victims and bring them back to the house, torturing them. Along the way, David brings Dean another victim, and his name is Elmer Wayne Henley. And for whatever reason, these two bond, and that's when Dean approaches Elmer and says, "I want to offer you an opportunity." Again saying, "Every victim you bring back, I will give you $200. When in reality, they would only get $5 to $10. At this point, things start to get out of control and ramp up, because you have David Brooks, and now you also have Elmer Henley, who are both bringing boys back to Dean. And the only reason that this comes to an end is because one of these accomplices actually turn against Dean. From 1970 to 1973, Dean Corll and his helpers, David Brooks and Elmer Henley, would help the Candyman abduct 28 boys ranging in age from 13 to 20. The three would take the boys back to Dean's home, where they would be tied to a torture board. Before being tied to this board, some were forced to write letters home to their family, letting them know that they were leaving and that they would be okay. One of the victims was 17-year-old Mark Scott, and he disappeared on April 20th, 1972. Parents quickly report him missing, and then a few days later they receive a postcard in the mail saying that he's accepted a job for $3 an hour and that he is fine and he's okay. The parents had common sense. They don't believe that their son would just leave town without saying goodbye. And the police just say to the parents, "Your child's run away. It's not illegal." Mind you, you have 28 young boys disappearing from the same neighborhood, and police are assuming that all of these boys have just run away. A grieving father went to police after 2 of his sons went missing, both of which were victims to Dean, the Candyman, and police told him that, both your boys just ran away. It wasn't until August 8th, 1973 when everything came to light. Elmer Henley brings back 2 friends. Their names are Tim Curley and Rhonda Williams. Mind you, Dean does not want girls in his home. When Elmer brings this girl back, he's furious. He keeps his cool and he lets the kids drink and huff paint. This makes them all pass out. Henley wakes up to find that he's tied alongside Rhonda and Tim. Dean starts screaming at Henley, threatening that he's going to unalive him, but first he's going to have his fun. Henley then pleads to Dean, saying, "I am so sorry, I will help you take care of both of these kids." Eventually Dean unties him and then takes Williams into the bedroom to tie him to the torture board, where now Elmer is left with just Rhonda. Rhonda then turns to Henley in disbelief and asks, "Is this real?" And Henley just replies yes. Rhonda then says something so simple, but it's effective, and she asks, "Are you going to do anything about it?" It's at this moment that Henley then interrupts Dean while he's in the middle of torturing, and he says, "I'm not going to let you keep killing my friends." It had to stop. It's at this moment that Dean replies, "Well, you're not going to do anything about it." And without another word, Henley then takes Dean's weapon and unloads it into his head. Henley quickly calls the police to the home, confessing what he's done. Within a week, investigators recovered 17 bodies from makeshift graves in a boathouse shed. Another 10 bodies were found in the woods. This is inside the boathouse when they started to uncover the bodies. Out of the 27 bodies identified, 3 have still not been. 7 reasons on why Dean Corll was one of the worst killers in American history. With community guidelines, I have to keep things PG, but just know, disclaimer, this is going to be upsetting. Number 1, the torture board. The board was involved in almost every murder, and once a victim was bound to the board, Dean would spend days torturing them, keeping them confined to this board. Victims' hands were locked by handcuffs at the top, and their legs were strapped down by nylon. According to Henley, the more Dean liked somebody, the longer he kept them alive and on this board. Number 2, once a victim was stripped down to the board, he would then use pliers to individually pluck out each of the hairs. He would specifically spend time pulling out the hair on their lower halves. Number 3, the use of glass rods. Dean would insert a thin glass rod in the victim's urethra before he would then break the rod while it was inside. When police discovered the torture room, they found many broken rods on the floor. Number 4, he literally bit the genitals off of one of his victims, all in one bite. Later, when this victim was found, his genitals were in a plastic bag buried next to his body. The medical examiner could determine that this was just one bite based off the imprints of teeth on. Number 5 would be the way he let his victims suffer in the end. Henley told police that there was a time when Dean accidentally shot the jaw off of a victim, and that this victim was alive for a very long time after this was done. Dean continued to assault him before he just left him to ultimately bleed out, which took a very long time. Dean also shot a victim in the chest and did the same exact thing. He let him slowly bleed. Number 6 would be the strangulation methods he would use, since that is a method that requires time. It's not fast. Many victims were found still with the cords around them. And 7 would be, out of all of this time that these victims were tied to this board, they were starving, and they were not being fed or given water. I have to be honest when I say reading about this was absolutely heartbreaking, and especially when you keep in mind that these victims, these weren't adults. These were boys ages 13 to 20. These were kids. I could only imagine what these boys went through, and also what their families went through, because they turned to police, and at the time the police just kept saying, "Your son ran away, there's nothing we can do," when meanwhile these boys were being held for days at a time being tortured. And then in the end this all comes out and they have to hear about what was done to their son. And the fact that there are still victims that were never identified, and those families have no idea what ultimately happened to them. Those boys were not even given a grave with their own name on it. It's heartbreaking when you actually start reading about the history of this. It's clear that Dean Corll was an evil person, and I hope that he is burning and rotting in hell.